Thank you for the introduction. Lots of extremely good points were made, so I'll be concise. So there were three questions being posed. What is the role of theory? How can neuroscience help AI? How can AI help neuroscience? So I'll start with that very quickly. Theory can mean different things to different people. It is unlikely, due to the very high complexity of neural networks, that we'll be able to have very precise theory at the level of where we can make incredibly good predictions like we do with physics. At the same time, theory is obviously useful. And you could see even today that once you give up on the desire to have extremely precise theory, then suddenly a lot of ideas around scaling of parameters, scaling of activations, their normalization, theory of optimization, suddenly all comes together and is obviously extremely useful for AI today. I am completely certain that more theory like this will continue to be useful. So that's the first point. Second, what can neuroscience give to AI? Indeed, it was already mentioned that very important giant ideas have come from neuroscience to AI. For example, the idea of a neuron, the idea of a distributed representation. Many of them were mentioned before by Demis, by Jeff right now. And it is possible that there is maybe one or two or three more such big ideas which we can borrow from neuroscience. But it takes great skill and incredible taste to borrow ideas from neuroscience successfully. The brain is immensely complex, and neuroscience produced an incredibly giant set of facts about the brain, about neurons, about their spikes and about their ion channels, maybe about the larger scale organization of the brain. And it is not at all obvious which of those ideas are incidental and that we should not worry about them, versus whether there is one particular idea in the brain that we perhaps can use as inspiration for our research. So I think it is possible that we will find in some small number of years that something that we've discovered has an analog in the brain, or perhaps that the inspiration will go from the brain to our AI systems. But it needs to be done carefully. And I would not say, oh yeah, just go look at the brain and copy it. So that's the second point. AI helping neuroscience. One very interesting thing, and it would be very, very amazing if it turned out to be true, is that there is this mounting evidence that the representations learned by artificial neural networks and that the representations learned by the brain, both in vision and in language processing, are showing more similarities than perhaps one would expect. I don't think this is something that was immediately obvious in advance. So maybe we will find that indeed by studying these amazing neural networks that everyone is producing right now, it will be possible to learn more about how the human brain works. That seems quite likely to me. I think it's fruitful. I also want to also echo and support Denis's point around some specific useful things that can be done in academia and in this center, one of which would be the evaluation, understanding what these models can do, how good are they really. It's very confusing. Sometimes you have these models, they show amazing flashes of brilliance on the one side. On the other side, they have these very strange, quite non-human failure modes. Getting more insight into what's going on there, and even better, trying to gain an understanding of where things will be. Any insight at all about where things will be a year from now or 2 years from now would be quite helpful, would be a very important contribution to be done outside of the big companies. I'll stop here.
So maybe we can sit. Let's try this arrangement with the virtual ones. I wanted to first show a couple of slides just to introduce the discussion. Yeah, because our panel, some people in our panel which did not hear this yesterday, but this was one reason I spoke about why theory is good. I was making the example of Volta discovering the battery, and the fact that that discovery brought really immediately a revolution, even if nobody understood what electricity was. In the 20 years after Volta invented a pila means pile of things, which are discs of zinc, cork, and copper. This thing here. And 20 years after that, there were electrical motors, electric generators, electrochemistry was done, telegraph lines. So it was a big revolution, but it's only much later that we had an understanding, a theory of electromagnetism with Maxwell. And of course, this contributed even more to powering the revolution of electricity. It's, 1800, it's not very long ago, 200 years or so. That's why theory, among many other reasons having to do with, for instance, what David mentioned before, and we want to understand ourselves. Having a theory means understanding what's going on. We would like to have a theory, and it does not need to be the same level of precision as physics or Maxwell equations. There may be just some fundamental principles. And then on the second point that was what Demis and also Ilya referred to about what a research program could look like, to be a kind of empirical study of different forms of intelligence. So large language models, different ones, possibly comparison with human intelligence. And this would be the level of cognition and at the level of what is inside the box. And one of the goals would be to look at systematic differences and common properties, common behaviors, if there is any, leading ideally to some fundamental principles common to these intelligent systems. There may be none. I personally believe there would be, and this would be maybe not an understanding in the precise sense of classical mechanics, but something equally useful and important. So let's start from here. Who wants to have a first take on this? Jeff, what about more on the theory? I guess you are on the negative side or neutral.
No, I'm not against theory. I think theory is great. It's just I don't do it. I'm not very good at math, and I much prefer doing more practical things. There's something I forgot to mention when I was talking about AI for neuroscience. I think it's made one huge contribution in neuroscience in the last few years, which I think is it's given us a much better understanding of the nature of language in the brain. So there's this crazy guy at MIT called Chomsky, who has been claiming it's all innate. We know now that doesn't have to be the case. And Chomsky's whole view of language is kind of crazy when you look back on it, because language is about conveying meaning. It's about conveying stuff. And Chomsky kind of ignored that aspect of it. It's as if you wanted to understand what a car is. And for all of us, understanding a car would mean a large part of it would be understanding how the engine works that makes it go. But you can imagine someone saying, no, the thing about cars is to understand why it is you get three-wheel cars and four-wheel cars, but you never get a five-wheel car. And that's what we need to understand about cars. And that seems to me like Chomsky's theory of language. He wanted to understand why certain syntactic constructions aren't possible. And as far as I can see, he did everything he could to avoid the basic issue of how does language mean. So And I think these large language models have put an end to that. Not in Chomsky's mind, but in more or less everybody else's mind.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, and also just mention about AI for neuroscience as well. Well, for what it's worth, Jeff, I've always thought Chomsky was completely wrong from my undergraduate days. And I think sent natural language processing down the wrong route for a long time. But maybe that's for another day, that discussion. But AI for neuroscience, I forgot to add that part. Like, I think maybe that's what should happen now is we have all these amazing AI techniques, and I know many people at MIT are doing this. Let's apply it across the board to, analyzing, decoding brain states, all sorts of things we used to do 10, 15 years ago, but obviously we have much, much better AI tools now. I feel like I've gone a little bit away from neuroscience the last few years, but my feeling of the field is, and maybe people would disagree in the room there, is that we need to start asking better questions on the neuroscience side. I just don't feel I've seen any results or that have been really major leaps in like learning theory or representations, or maybe I just haven't seen the papers. But I like work from people like Tim Behrens and stuff like that in Oxford and UCL, but I just haven't seen the huge flourishing of that I felt was there maybe 20 years ago when fMRI came in as a new tool. And maybe there's a chance to do that now if you think of AI, the AI systems we're building as new tools, new analysis tools from a neuroscience point of view. Feels like we should be doing different types of experimental neuroscience, perhaps. That's just a question for the neuroscientists in the room. I feel like, but then I just want to emphasize again the evaluations and benchmarks point, in addition to what you listed, Tommy, on your slide, that it's really important that we do that as a field, like create the right benchmarks, which does require theory as well. Theory of what is it we're creating the benchmarks to theory of emergent capabilities. I don't think there's any theory of these emergent properties, where they come from, how these systems produce those emergent properties. If we had better theories about that, then I think we could build better benchmarks, and then we would have a better handle of when they might appear.
I think my first bullet was about benchmarking, or
okay, maybe
looking at the common and different features, aspect, behaviors of machines and humans and between machines. But yes, any neuroscientists in the audience want to answer to Demi's challenge? Jim.
So I think some of us have drank that Kool-Aid a while ago, that we're using these things as our best predictors of what's going on and then driving experiments from those. That creates new phenomena that we post as benchmarks. What's unclear is how to use those phenomena to then turn the crank again to build a deeper understanding. And some of us have also been on the benchmark bank for a number of years too, which also is not typical in the field of neuroscience and cognitive science. So it's been hard going, but it's great to hear you guys support both those ideas. And those things take dollars and money, and also a change in mindset, I think, of how experiments are done and why they're done, not to necessarily create immediate understanding, but to fuel those pumps. But that next turn of the crank, beyond the experiment and the predictions and whether the experimental effort doesn't amend itself towards the incentive structure of the field, where a lab is supposed to produce a result and then a deep understanding it. So doing science at scale through platforms like that, I think, is where we need to head. And I hear that in everything you guys are saying. And I think that's a great opportunity for us to treat the AI generators as hypothesis builders, and us to shape them into which one is most like the brain. Let's track that way. And that requires those benchmarking platforms and those experimental things to run together to make that reality. So I'm just channeling back what you said, just trying to say I'm on board with that Kool-Aid, and I hope more people could be. And if you could help us in some ways, that would be awesome. Thanks.
Slightly different direction from what Demis was saying, related though. And earlier today, someone made the point that studying an AI system, a large language transformer architecture that is displaying intelligence, is a lot easier than studying the brain, because you can poke around at it, you can get whatever you want and analyze it without much effort. It seems to me that the brain is much more complex than a transformer, and if we can't really figure out what's going on in the transformer architectures at a level that is allowing us to say, oh, now we really understand what it's doing, it'll be almost impossible to do it for the brain, which is going to be much more complicated. So I see a benefit of, essentially shifting some of the neuroscience work to these architectures that are displaying intelligence.
So if I could add my perspective. I think we may be at the moment over-indexing on language as a field of interest. And we should not forget that humans are just one species out of very many who exhibit intelligence. And a fundamental principle in science is to study a phenomenon in the simplest possible embodiment so that one can get to the bottom of it more quickly and start from the simpler version to understand the principles. And so neuroscience has been doing this, and so we do C. elegans about order of 100 neurons. We have fruit fly, order of 100,000, mouse, order of 100 million, human, 100 billion. And we should not forget all of these different trade-offs between power consumption, performance, adaptability, and view the problem of intelligence in the context of many different species, if not all of them. So that's something that neuroscience can contribute to keep our attention on different forms of intelligence.
It's interesting that different people have very different views about that spectrum. So I was once talking to Steve Pinker, and I asked him, suppose we understood exactly how a rat worked, we understood everything we could possibly want to understand about a rat. Would we be more or less than halfway towards understanding human intelligence? And I think most biologists would say you'd be most of the way there. Stephen Pinker said, oh no, you'd be much less than halfway to understanding human intelligence.
Yeah. Well, that's a matter of taste, but so we don't know actually, right? once we are there, but I think you agree, Jeff, right, that it's worth keeping our attention on all of these different forms and not obsess about humans and language.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mark.
Yeah, I've been wondering if psychophysics should be brought into the discussion in a more direct way. I think everybody's talking about neuroscience as though it has to do specifically with the physics of neurons and interconnections and that stuff. But the behavior of humans and other animals as reflected in psychophysical experiments, and I think there's an opportunity to get to benchmarks that way that could be applied both to engineered intelligent systems as well as biological systems that would really provide an opportunity to do comparisons without having to go all the way to the neuron or to whatever the description of the computation is.
Can I have the slide for a second? Yeah, I think the first point here, the first bullet, is psychophysics or cognitive science or measure of behavior, benchmarking including. The second one is more like recordings. I think the first one is the more important in these cases.
But I wonder what the panel, when they refer to neuroscience, what they meant.
Let's ask them, the virtual panel.
Psychophysics, I totally agree, by the way, that psychophysics is actually exactly what we need. And we even, maybe we were slightly premature with this, but about maybe even almost a decade ago, we had a thing called PsychLab, which is like a virtual test lab for AI systems. And I think it's precisely that, the behavioral testing under very rigorous controls is probably something we need to push a lot harder on, as opposed to just the sort of neural recording equivalent. So I totally agree that psychophysics should be a huge part of it.
So one question of clarification. If you look at something like AlexNet, it bases most of its decision, it relies a lot on texture. And if you look at these new AI generative models, they rely much less on texture for doing classification. Is that the kind of thing you call psychophysics? Yeah. In that case, yeah, I think we need a lot more of that.
But it would be also other things, Jeff, like testing like memory situations and setups, like kind of practical little experiments. Actually, we used to model them on rat experiments originally, but you might have to update them now because our systems are too sophisticated.
I think one of the nice things about the fact that these very powerful models exist is that some of the ideas that are being discussed here about using psychophysics as an inspiration, like we don't need to make a discussion, we can just go and try it. And like very quickly already get some interesting results to discuss. And by we, I don't just mean people in the big labs. I mean, there are powerful open source models now. There is model access, like big labs provide model access for researchers. So we could find out very quickly.
So it may be interesting to hear from Open AI and DeepMind, how do you allocate your resources? So you clearly have obvious commercial industrial goals, and yet you will not be successful unless you do good work somehow. So how do you allocate your resources between just technology, theory, and neuroscience? How do you view that within your companies?
Maybe one way to think of it, I don't know if you would agree, but in industry in general, there tends to be more hill climbing, where you bet on a particular approach and then you keep improving it. In academia, there's more jumping around because your academia is constantly being pollinated with new thinkers, with new ideas, and there's no infrastructure really for hill climbing anyway, not scaling things up. So this is in my mind, a natural division of ideation.
So the question implied that there is tension between the needs of the product and the needs of research. And there is some sense in which it is true. There is a different sense in which it is a lot less true. And I want to explain the sense in which it is less true. It is pretty obvious that there is a fair bit of competition between the different companies on how well their AI is doing. Which means that if you become a little bit too short-sighted, then next year or in 2 years, your AI will not be doing as well. And so that creates a lot of desire and simple commercial incentive to continue to improve the AI. Improve doesn't also mean to make it more capable. It also means to make the near-term AIs more safer, as well as to do work on making our longer-term AIs, especially ones that will be smarter than people, and those AIs will be built too, by the way, super intelligent AIs, to make them safe, aligned, and generally positively predisposed to humanity. But how do you do this? How do you work on this long-term research? And there is no easy answer, right? There's basically two answers. You can hire lots of great researchers and give them freedom. This is one approach that can be done. Another approach is if you have correct top-down ideas you're confident in, you could reduce your search space and make progress this way. And that's basically, it's like, how is the philosophy? How are we thinking about how things should be as opposed to merely how they are right now? I think all these things factor in together to continue to make progress.
So,
okay.
May I ask one more question? I mean, agitate another question. So I want to go back to something that Demis was saying before, which is we need to invest more on testing and understanding how to test, which resonates very much with me. I was involved in the field of vision with defining problems through benchmarks, and that worked for a while. Now I find that when I think about these large vision and language models, it's becoming more and more complicated to define what is the task and then what is the benchmark that we should use to measure it. And so I feel like many of us at the moment don't have a good compass to decide whether what is going on is better or worse than before. And when you when you think about the life of a scientist in a company or in a university trying to decide if they're doing better or not, they often rely on fairly simple-minded benchmarks that you find in somebody's paper somewhere, and you don't even know if they mean anything. And looking at the neuroscience aspect, I think we also have a little bit of that in the sense that we are interested in understanding how the brain works, but many of us in the labs end up with very stereotyped preparations where the animal has to perform a task that is even unclear whether it has any ecological meaning for the animal, and the animal overlearns it over months, and then we study what the neurons do, and it's very unclear what it does in our perspective of the ecological value of intelligence. And so it feels like in both fields, we need to rethink what is intelligence good for, what is behavior, what are animals or automata trying to achieve, and how to measure, in some ways, the fitness of ecological fitness of these creatures. So it feels like it's a very rich set of questions that Demis brought up, and I'm wondering if, I don't know, so we know what Demis thinks, but I'm wondering if Jeff and Ilya have thoughts on that, whether they agree with what I say, that it's difficult to measure performance.
Yeah, so there is no doubt whatsoever that measuring performance is extremely difficult. I want to give some examples. You may have heard claims, those of you who have been in AI, so let's say in the mid-2010s, claims around superhuman performance on vision being achieved. Like at some point, some researchers have achieved superhuman performance on vision on the ImageNet dataset. Well then, but we were obviously not superhuman at this task. How can that be? Well, but it wasn't really too big of a deal because these neural nets, it was just an academic project, a research project that some very motivated and passionate individuals were working on. They didn't matter. Now we have much more sophisticated neural nets. They are being used widely, and it is difficult to understand their performance. If you take, let's say, any one of the large large language model chatbots that you can find online, and you ask them to solve a hard math problem, and they solve it, is it because they reasoned and understood, or is it because they saw something somewhat similar, or perhaps moderately similar in the training set? And training sets are quite large, and this creates confusion. You may see people posting really excitedly cool examples of behavior, they go viral. Then other people try to do similar things and they fail. It's not to say that our neural nets don't work, they obviously do, but it does say that measurement is genuinely not straightforward. And this is an area where I think there is room for very meaningful conceptual and empirical contributions.
One little comment I have. I used to do experiments on GPT-4 before it could look at the web, when I was fairly confident that everything it knew happened before January of 2023, or was it 22? And so you could log off, log on again, and then ask it a slightly varied version of the question and get a different response. And I didn't think you're going to be able to do that anymore. As soon as anybody talks about doing an experiment, GPT-4 will be able to see discussion on the web about that experiment, is my guess. It's going to be very, very hard to do any kind of systematic experiments.
So, Pietro, maybe my thought on this is, look, if it was easy, it had been done already, right? So it's definitely not easy, because all the people on this call, and well, I've been thinking about this for, we've all been thinking about it 15, 20 years, and we have a lot of, thousands of researchers and whatever. It's very hard. But my point is, this is my pitch to Tommy of like I believe MIT, this is what I would do if I was at MIT in CBMM right now. Don't worry about building this sort of compute race of like building the largest models. I think most of the leading labs would give you access to the models for analysis and safety work and so on. So assume you have that, right? So you don't need to join that race. What we really need, and what I think you're hearing from everybody from the leading labs, is this involves theory, involves neuroscience, involves psychophysics, involves practical experimentation. Is how are we going to wrestle these questions of emerging properties, right benchmarks, testing these new types of intelligences, as Ilya says. Like we've all seen this, like in AlphaGo, you have a system, it's better than the world champion, but if you get it out of distribution, you can make it do weird things even today. I mean, we could fix that, but there's no point for Go. But it's just, these are kind of lumpy intelligences that sort of seem they can have big delta sort of holes in what they know because of the way that they're trained in a way that a human intelligence can't have, right? Because of the way that humans learn. So it may even require whole sort of new theories or meta theories of learning that we don't have today. So I think it's an extremely rich space for the next 5-10 years, which probably plays into the strengths of what MIT and CBMM can do. And I think it's extremely badly needed and urgently needed. And it's probably complementary to what the leading labs are good at. I mean, we try to do a bit of that at Google DeepMind. We do have some neuroscientists. That's pretty unusual already for AI labs. But there isn't enough, that they're not attracted to do that kind of work in those kind of places. So I think this is a big opportunity, and it's I think desperately needed if one thinks about deploying these systems and the safety of these systems and grappling with that over the next decade as we get closer to, AGI or human level intelligence. So I think there couldn't be a clearer, in my view, sort of mission or clarion call. And in addition, that will help, of course, understand the human mind in many different ways we've discussed today as well. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I'll add just quickly on the benchmarking problem. I agree with everything that has been said. Benchmarking is extremely difficult in part because even if it's a well-defined problem, so certain problems have a right answer and you can benchmark. But most problems don't have a right answer. They have, it depends on, context, for example, or it depends on, your, we were talking about this early, your philosophical framework is overlaid onto, so there really needs to be some thinking on, what we even mean by benchmarking when you're dealing with, fuzzy outputs, and I don't really know. And I would add to that benchmarking is really important because if you decide on your benchmarking function, then people will tune essentially their models to maximize, they should, their performance on that. And so if you got the benchmarking function wrong, you could end up building things that aren't, that are good at the wrong things, so to speak.
Very good. There are many other questions that I want to ask, but before that, let's open to the audience the possibility to ask questions. So let's see, there was somebody was the first one. Well, we'll go randomly.
Oh.
Jean-Jacques.
Yeah, so this has been kind of alluded to before, but maybe let me ask this a little more directly. So we've been all raised with the idea of evolution, right? And particularly the fact that the brain evolved from the refinement of sensory motor control. There's the vignette of the sea squirt, which is this little animal which swims and then fixates itself on a rock. And at this point, swallows its own brain because it doesn't need to do motion anymore. Okay. So here we are at a strange place now with LLMs, right, where we have language before emotion. In a sense, we have conversational agents and so on, but we nowhere near to having a robot plumber, let's say. And it's true that LLMs have, of course, absorbed, as Demis would say, all the knowledge of the internet and so on. But for instance, I am certainly incapable of describing the details of what I'm doing, what I'm manipulating something, what am I sensing, so this is not something which is easily describable. So are we missing something by having this kind of language before motion behavior?
I think it's not entirely true. I mean, maybe Ilya could comment on the Rubik's Cube.
I think the analogy that the data that exists is a fossil fuel is great. And thus far, this fossil fuel played an important role in making the AI that we have today. And at least for now, at least up until this point, in the past, robots were expensive and there wasn't any robotic data. It was expensive, no one could train big neural nets and run them on robots. So the recipe that's been working today did not apply to robots. Changing very quickly, if you look at some of the advancements in robotics that various labs are producing, it's looking pretty good. I mean, from there's really cool work from Google, DeepMind, from recently from the Toyota TTIC, Toyota Technology Institute. They've been training really cool neural nets that control robots like flip pancakes and stuff like this. And now it's becoming possible. People now believe that it's possible, whereas before they didn't. So indeed, it is true that one could argue that perhaps things, the AI we have aren't quite as complete, certainly not future complete as a robot. But if you look at the advanced progress in robotics, I think in a few years, things will look very, very different then.
Yeah. I agree with that, Ilya. And I mean, we just released our RTX sort of generalist robot system, and it's it's still far from anything that's generally capable of robotics. But I wouldn't hold out that this is different from. I think language was was already very hard, and that was doable. And we have other ways to get around it. I think very realistic simulations, physics simulations, and also just gathering more data from large robot farms, arm farms. I think there's ways to get around this, and then generalizing from general models and into the robotics domain. I don't think it's going to be that hard in the next few years. So I wouldn't over-index on embodied being different, in my opinion.
For those of us who sit in the intersectionality of industry and academic work, when we think about how to apply theories into practice to drive innovation, enhance lives, blah, 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 in the real world, here are some questions I want to, one question I want to ask is, we all know the importance of framing a question, a problem, right? And we talked about, I think some of the people who talks about the holes and assumptions, what happened in blind spots. So here's the thing. If you can go back 20 years from ago, and you look at this AI field, what are potential blind spots back then that you may not perceived of that translated to today? I think for David, for example, when you started 2 Sigma, what were things in your journey when starting this company with using machine technology in a very, very imperfect real world, data imperfection, system dynamics, conflicting motivations between different parties? What are some of those blind spots that may help us as perhaps teaching data and inform and infer how we may look at AI and humans the next 20 years?
Just one quick answer to that. If you're essentially learning off of the wrong data or incorrect data, you're going to obviously get undesirable output. And so if you don't have a theory and you're just essentially being entirely data driven, you better be very careful about the data. And so that I think is a kind of a general lesson to keep in mind when things become very empirical.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of ask the panelists from industry how we could push the envelope on really actually bringing large-scale, psychophysically controlled experimentation and alignment research to the ground here at a place like MIT. So I think it would be no small exaggeration to say that at least in the last 5 years, what I've observed in this community is the biggest contribution to neuroscience/AI research has been Facebook's PyTorch models. Those tend to be the models that we use in our research. We attempt to try and draw experiments across the open source available versions of those models, but I think it would be quite beneficial to be able to do both sort of large-scale experimental grid searches over, for example, psychophysical parameters in an experiment, but also, smaller-scale model psychophysical searches where we're able to train much smaller models than something like GPT, but would still need to do it at large scale to train many different versions to test many different hypotheses. It's sort of like Hubel and Wiesel were doing a grid search, but on a screen with a little pen and a piece of paper. If we could do that at the scale that industry is training models, we might actually be able to pursue alignment research at a much higher clip. So I'm wondering what the doors to that might be, how you're thinking about that, what resources you might be willing to devote to that, and how we could get that conversation rolling on how to do experimentation at scale with robust controls and checks from academia, but with the resources of industry.
Well, look, I mean, I can just give a short answer to that. Look, I think the leading labs are willing to, and we're talking to government about this as well, like provide access to the models. So, we should just sort of think about that as a starting point, right? And some of those models there's a whole question about open sourcing, which is a little bit out of scope today, which is to do with, obviously, we're big proponents of open science, and we've published many things in the past that's underpinned a lot of the advances you see today. But as these systems become more and more powerful, we have to answer the questions, like obvious questions, in my opinion, like bad actor use case. Bad actors getting hold of powerful technology and then repurposing them for bad ends, right? And bad actors could be individuals or nation states. So one has to have an answer to these questions, while still obviously keeping the open science flowing. So it's not easy. That's another thing that's incredibly difficult. Otherwise, it would have been solved already.
Yeah, I'll briefly comment on this as well. It is the case that OpenAI, and I believe many other AI labs, provide access to their models for academic research, and that's really the answer. Large models are expensive, but you can still do a lot of things with them. Certainly much easier to run, let's say, psychophysics-inspired experiments on models compared to human beings or rats or something like this.
My name is Manolis Kellis. I'm a professor at MIT in AI and computer science, and my research on genomics, computational biology, and also a lot of molecular neuroscience, so the molecular underpinnings of human disease. So a lot of us in this meeting have been wondering a lot about the diversity of human neurons and how vulnerability is associated with schizophrenia and neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's, etc., are in fact pointing to very specific neuronal mechanisms, very specific subclasses of neurons. And there's a big debate, and today we talked a lot about that, about how much does it really matter that we have different types of neurons in the brain? How much should we try to understand the role of this extraordinary diversity of dozens of different types of excitatory and inhibitory neurons, the role of glial cells, etc.? Is AI, at this point, in your view, completely disconnected from that? Do you think that there's just an evolutionary weird byproduct of the way that we had to get to where we are today that led to this extraordinary complexity of the brain? And if we were to start over with just a giant cortex or something, then we would have been just as intelligent. And related to that, I mean, we're talking a lot about sort of embodied intelligence, about the role of emotions, the role of sort of having the convergence of multiple sensory inputs, the ability to memorize, through these engrams, if you wish. So I'm just curious, in your view, is sort of human intelligence just only useful for understanding the human? Or could there be some true paradigm shifting capabilities that could emerge from understanding how this bag of noodles has kind of achieved what it takes a factory of energy to achieve in terms of cognition? And of course, the bag of noodles may be left behind, but at what expense in terms of energy? So I'm curious about sort of that back and forth question that I think was part of Tommy's premise earlier on.
My guess is that the brain's been highly optimized over a long evolutionary period. So it's got all these different kinds of neurons because it helps to have all these different kinds of neurons, but that it could do pretty well with far fewer types. Obviously, it needs several types. So things like layer normalization in the AI models were inspired by inhibition in the brain. So there's a little bit of neural diversity in these AI models that comes from that. But my guess is it's sort of Crick's view, which is that evolution's a tinkerer, and it's been tinkering for a long time, and it's come up with all these little tricks that are instantiated in different kinds of neurons. But you probably don't need all of those to get an intelligent system.
I have one quick comment on this, which is, if we take a trained neural network, perhaps a large trained open source model, we may already discover lots of interesting neuron types. In fact, that is very likely to be the case.
So the panel is phenomenal. So I would like to ask you, what is your opinion about AI-enabled scientific revolution? Is AI everything? Is something AI cannot be done? So combine AI with the science. Yes.
Demis has already shown it can be done.
Yeah. Well, look, that's been my goal and passion from the start. This is why I've worked my whole life on AI, is to exciting moment now where we can apply it to helping us understand the world and the universe around us. So I think AlphaFold is my calling card for that, of what we may be able to do. And I hope when we look back on it in 10 years' time, it will just be the beginning of a new sort of era of AI-enabled biology or AI-enabled science. I think right now, the way I think about this is looking at all the systems we've built, you can boil it down to sort of quite simply, really. I think for situations where you've got massive combinatorial search space, and often there's a lot of things that can be couched like that, maybe material design, chemistry, lots of things in biology. And then there's a solution, there's a solution to that, whether that's like the correct protein fold out of all the possible ways a protein could fold, for example. You've got to find, you need a model, first of all, of the underlying space, so that you can therefore search that, intractable space in a tractable way to find that needle in a haystack answer. And AlphaGo is basically, that's what AlphaGo is, right? But obviously in the game of Go, because it would be impossible to just do the search on its own. You need a model, some kind of reasonable model. It doesn't even have to be that good of Go and the dynamics of Go and the motifs in Go. And it's the same with AlphaFold. So I think right now, there are many problems in science that I think if you couch it like that could be solved already with existing systems, let alone the next systems that come along that might be able to generate new hypotheses and things like that themselves. I don't think we're at that stage yet. We have to put in the hypotheses and frame the question and give it the data and sort of build the model and so on. So that's very much a tool right now for human experts to use, which is what we do. But and it's very general. We're applying it to not just biology, but chemistry, to fusion, plasma containment fusion, and also mathematics and theorem proving. So there's actually, I think there's when you start thinking of it in that way, there are a lot of problems in science that could fit that type of setup.
Appropriate problem for what we're talking about today. I've always believed that AI will advance rapidly enough that it will actually help us perhaps solve the problem of understanding the brain. And we should really be applying this full circle.
Yeah, let me take a quick poll among all of the panelists. One question that was underlying underneath what you said and what was discussed many times is how original or creative are the latest large language models. Of course, we know that, for instance, AlphaGo did some pretty creative moves when it won its match in South Korea. So that's possible. But to be very concrete, do you think the existing models or some, the next GPT-4, say GPT-5 or so, will be able to state a new non-trivial mathematical conjecture? I'm not saying proving it. I'm saying stating it. Who think it's possible within the next 5 years?
Are you sure that the current model cannot do it?
I'm not sure, absolutely. Do you know whether it can?
I mean,
let me give you an example of something creative that GPT-4 can already do that most people can't do. So we're still trapped in the idea of thinking that logical reasoning is the essence of intelligence, when we know that
Not
being
really,
able to see,
but some people.
well,
yeah,
we know that being able to see analogies, especially kind of remote analogies, is a very important aspect of intelligence. So I asked GPT-4, what has a compost heap got in common with an atom bomb? And GPT-4 nailed it. Most people just say nothing.
What did it say?
It started off by saying they're very different energy scales. So on the face of it, they look to be very different. But then it got into chain reactions and how the rate at which they're generating energy increases, their energy increases the rate at which they generate energy. So it got the idea of a chain reaction. And the thing is, it knows about 10,000 times as much as a person. So it's going to be able to see all sorts of analogies that we can't see.
Yeah, so my feeling is on this, and starting with things like AlphaGo and obviously today's systems like Bard and GPT, they're clearly creative in some sense. Like if you get them to do poetry, they're pretty amazing poetry now. We have systems that can create great music, lots of things that we would regard as very creative, all the image stuff, text to image stuff. I still think what you're asking, though, Tommy, is not possible, in my opinion. I would guess. I mean, we can't categorically say it, because I think there's three types. I've talked about this before, probably with you and maybe even at CBMM about. I think of it as three levels of creativity, and we clearly have the first two. So first is interpolation, just averaging what you've seen to create something, a prototypical new thing, like a new cat from all the cat images you've seen. Right, that's the lowest level of creativity. Then there's extrapolation, which is, I think, where we're at. So that's like Move 37 with AlphaGo, new Go strategies, new pieces of music, new pieces of poetry, and spotting analogies between things you couldn't spot as a human. And I think these systems can definitely do that. But then there's a third level, which I call like invention or out of the box thinking. And that would be the equivalent of AlphaGo inventing Go, not coming up with a good Go move, but inventing Go. Or inventing chess, right? And they can't do that. Something that's as good that we as human sort of game aficionados would regard as classically good, in some aesthetic way, right? As good. And they can't, right? And so that's the thing that's missing. Or Picasso coming up with cubism, or a great mathematician coming up with new conjecture. But I don't believe that it's magic. I think that we will have systems that can do that. But I don't think they can do that today. And there's something missing still, but I think we will be able to do that in future.
So I agree with Demis. What about Ilya? Do you agree, or?
I mean, I think that the neural networks that exist today are clearly and unquestionably creative. They are not as creative as the most creative humans in history in all areas. So I think that would be a truth.
Yeah, I was asking about mathematics in practice. But
well, like conjectures, it's a bit tricky, right?
It goes to exactly what Demis said. Can you invent group theory from, or something?
That's different from a conjecture, I'll just say. Group theory is a little bit, it's a pretty high bar we're talking about here. Literally nothing else will remain after.
I think a lot of this goes back to the benchmarking question. Even on creativity, how do you benchmark it? So I would say that one of the things that I struggle with is, without benchmark, computers forever have been able to outperform humans, from almost the moment they were invented in certain tasks. And so to really understand what's going on here, and I'm not disagreeing with anything being said, but we really should focus on the benchmarking problem, as Demis and others have pointed out.
Just a historical comment. I've lived through a long period of time when I've seen people say neural nets will never be able to do X. The collected works of Gary Marcus is a nice history of that. So I don't believe those statements anymore, because for almost all the things people have said, they can now do them. And people, proving a mathematical theorem used to be something, well, neural networks will never do that. And people just keep moving the task, making it harder and harder. And I completely agree with Demis. There's no reason to believe there's anything that people can do that they can't do. We may not be able to come up with, they may not be able to come up with profound new mathematical conjectures yet, but that doesn't mean they won't be able to in 20 years' time.
But we agree about that. We have a proof of existence. The brain is a neural network, so.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's something non-computable going on in the brain, right?
And exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, very clever ones, maybe, or very sophisticated or very evolved ones.
Yeah. Now, my question was about the existing paradigm, some transformer and large language models. And even starting from this, not sure whether I'm invading some proprietary area here, but do you have any idea what the next architecture after transformers could be? Jeff, you must have some idea.
If I did have an idea, I wouldn't say it in public until I had a publication. Or at least until I had a grad student working on it.
Pietro, any idea?
No.
Ilya? Yes, but you cannot speak about it, I understand. All right. So,
So much for open science.
So let me move to neuroscience. I think the question is, what would be a breakthrough in neuroscience that would be a big impact on machine learning? And I think if we could know more about how learning is done in the brain, whether it's done by back propagation or something else, what this something else is, that would be great. I think, one of the most dramatic agent in the explosive progress of neural networks has been back propagation and gradient descent. So, the question is if that, like many people think, it's unlikely to be biologically plausible. I think it would be quite interesting to know how the brain does it, and that may have the potential to have an impact on AI as well. But you may think that there are other potential breakthrough in neuroscience that may have an impact in machine learning. Do you have any idea? Please.
Well, I think it's fairly clear that the brain isn't going to be doing backpropagation through time. That seems very unlikely. All the theories of how the brain does backpropagation that I know of are for doing backpropagation through multiple cortical areas. It's also fairly clear that these big language models, and the multimodal ones too, are storing far more information per connection than the brain. Now, it may just be because they've got far more experience, and we will be able to get much more if we have much more experience. But I suspect now, I've always thought the brain must be doing some form of backpropagation, but I now suspect it may be doing something dumber. But if I could get one question answered by GPT-20, it would be, does the brain implement some form of backpropagation?
This was great. Thank you all.
Thanks everyone.